Hello everyone, welcome to session 12 of LTEC 654, Programming Games and Simulations. This week I want to talk about two things. First, I want to talk a little bit about how to manage complex strings in Godot. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So here's a really simple example. If you take a look at line 8, I have a label node and I'm setting the text property of that node to be equal to the string we are waiting for space plus person1. And if we look up at line 3, we can see that person1 is a variable and its value is equal to the string Peter. And so if we were to actually run this code, for output, we would see we are waiting for Peter. So very simple example of how to use a string and apply it to a label. Now, here's a slightly different example, something you may have run across before. If we look at line 8, we are waiting for plus person1 dot to upper. So I'm using the toUpper method to transform the variable Peter with a capital P in all lowercase letters to be all uppercase. And so the output here is we are waiting for Peter, all uppercase. And of course, here you are seeing that we can do the same thing with the toLower method, which converts a string into all lowercase. Now, we've also seen this semester times where strings can get pretty complicated. So take a look at this example where the output is we are waiting for Peter, Paul, and Mary. And so if you look at line 8 of the sample code, you can see we are saying we are waiting for plus person1 plus comma plus person2 plus comma and plus person3. And that's getting pretty cumbersome to manage. And so Godot offers some different ways of managing complex strings. And this has to do with what Godot calls format strings. And format strings are really a feature that allows us to reuse text templates to create different but similar strings. So let's take a look at our ready function. And on line 8, we are going to see variable format string equals we are waiting for, and then we see this kind of strange %s. And so what does that mean? Well, the percentage sign is the placeholder of a variable. And the S means we're just going to do a simple string conversion. So whatever variable we put in place of the placeholder is going to become a string. And so how do we do that? Well, we say on line 9, variable actual string equals format string placeholder, and then we pass the variable we want to pass, in this case person1. And then we can set in line 10 our label text equals actual string. What would be the output of that code? We would see we're waiting for Peter. Essentially, we've accomplished the same thing that we did in the earlier examples. We've just did it in a different way using format strings. Now, let's take a look at another example. And here, everything is exactly the same, but if you look at line 9, I'm saying format string placeholder person2. And so the output here becomes we're waiting for Paul instead of Peter. Now, one of the nice things that you can do with format strings is we can use multiple format specifiers. So take a look at line 8. In line 8, it says format string equals, we're waiting for placeholder, placeholder, and placeholder. And so in line 9, we have to pass in those placeholders. So we say format string placeholder, and then we list all of the placeholders that we want to pass. Now, the order here is important, person1, person2, person3, because that's what's going to get displayed. And we also need to enclose that list of variables in square brackets, and we want to separate them by commas. So the output, if we take a look at line 10, would be we're waiting for Peter, Paul, and Mary. In other words, person1, person2, person3. This is an example of where string formats can become quite powerful. Now, another way that they can be quite powerful is when we want to round decimal points. And because we're running or thinking about running business simulations like the lemonade stand, I thought this was important. Now take a look at this example. Here I have a float In other words, a number that has a decimal point in my variable value 1. And if I convert that to a string and print it out, it would look like this. We are waiting for 1.2533. And we could do the same thing with a format string where we're using our template. We're waiting for placeholder. And if I pass in the placeholder value 1, the output that I get would be the same. We're waiting for 1.2533. Now, this is what I want to show you. What if you want to round that number to 2 decimal places? Well, this is how you do it. Take a look at line 6. Here we're saying format string equals, we're waiting for placeholder, but after the placeholder, the percent sign, we're saying 0.2, meaning we want to go 2 decimal points of a float, F. That means a real number. And so the output here, if we passed format string placeholder value 01, the output would be we're waiting for 1.25. So that's a way to round that much longer float number. Now, let's take it just one step further. What if we wanted to do something more complicated in our games? So here you can see an example. I have 3 variables, an ingredient name, an ingredient price, and then the currency name. And so what I want to be able to do is very flexibly, using a template, is say the price of placeholder is placeholder per unit. In other words, the price of vanilla is 5.33 gold coins per unit. And so for my format string, I'm passing in 3 specifiers or 3 variables: ingredient 1 name, ingredient 1 price, and the currency name. And as a result, I can use this template in a very flexible way by just passing in those variables. Okay, so now I want to go back to talk a little bit about programming the purchasing scene. So we can remember from last week that in the lemonade stand, we essentially have to navigate linearly through all of these scenes. But one of the more important scenes is the purchasing scene. And I have a very simple mock-up here that we saw last week. And I want to talk a little bit about how we might program this to get this working. So first, I want you to understand that what you're seeing here highlighted in red is actually a scene. And that scene is constructed like this. There's a color rectangle, that's the white background, and it has a number of children. It has page name, which is a label up at the top. It has a round label, day 1 of 3 days. It has a balance label, current balance $25.25. And then ingredient 1 is actually a horizontal container. And that horizontal container has 2 items. It has a label and it has a button. And importantly, these are some of the global variables in my code. And I'm going to show you how I use these in a couple of minutes. But you can see here I have, like in line 6, a variable name called name of currency. I also have the player's current balance. I also have the name of an ingredient, in this case water. I have the price of that ingredient, as well as the quantity of that ingredient. And right now I have 0 units of water. So let's take a look at how we actually might program this. When the add purchasing scene becomes available, this is the code that runs. As you can see, I remove the previous scene. I instantiate the purchasing scene out of my library. I set the name property to purchasing. And then I'm using what we just talked about with format strings to say day blank of blank days. In other words, day 1 of 3 days. And I'm using a string template in order to do that. And ultimately, in line 83, I'm saying get the round label, get that node, and set its text value to be the actual string. And then, of course, I'm adding that as a child to body. I'm making the back button visible. And then I'm calling a custom function, refresh the purchasing data. So let's take a look at what that function actually does. So here's my code for refresh purchasing data. So the first thing that this does is it reaches into the body node and gets the child node purchasing. And that way I have a reference to it. And then in line 91, I'm saying the current balance is equal to something. And I'm getting 2 decimal places here. In line 93, I'm setting the balance label text to be equal to that string. And then what I'm doing in line 94 and 95 is I'm using another string template to say that I have 0 units of water. So in other words, I'm passing in the quantity of ingredient 1 and the name of ingredient 1 in line 95. And then importantly, I am attaching a signal to the button that's a child of my horizontal container named ingredient 1. And I'm listening for a pressed signal. When the user clicks that buy more button, I'm calling a custom function called buy ingredient 1. So let's take a look at what happens when the buy ingredient 1 function actually executes. Well, what happens is this little scene at the bottom here appears, and it says how many units of water do you want to buy? And it tells me the price of water. And then there's what we call a spin box or a number stepper, and then it tells me the total price. So let's take a look at how this was built. So just down there in the bottom quarter of the screen, I have a sprite called Group 2, and it has a background, a color rect named background, and that's just the black. And then there is a vertical organizer, a vertical container that has the title label, the price label, the spin box, the total label, and the purchase button. And then outside of my vertical container is the close button. And the close button is simply that X in the upper right-hand corner. So what happens when the buy ingredient 1 function runs? Well, here's the code. Now, this looks like a lot, but what I've done here is I am calling lots of little functions that are designed to do very small things. So for example, line 144, disable the buy more buttons. And all that I'm not going to show that, but all that function does is when the user is currently buying water, all of the other buy more buttons should be disabled. And then in line 145, I'm saying fade in the purchasing footer. That's what you're seeing here. I'm just using a tween to fade that in. Now let's take a look at update purchase prompt. And really all I'm doing here is saying how many units of placeholder do you want to buy? And we know because this is ingredient 1 and the name of ingredient 1 is water. And so it's simply asking how many units of water do you want to buy? That's all that function does. Now I have an if statement in here in line 70 because I know eventually my game is going to have more than one ingredient. So I have to be able to keep track of those. But I want to be able to expand this code by specifying ingredient 2, ingredient 3, ingredient 4, so on and so forth. Now the next function that I call manually is update price per unit. And let's take a look at that function. And again, here I'm using a string formatter or a template, and I'm simply saying that the price of water is blank gold coins per unit. And I'm just using that template to fill in those variables. Very simple. Now the next line of code is to reset the spin box to 0. Let's take a look at that. Now, again, the spin box is simply the number stepper that allows the user to step up or step down in how many units they want to purchase. And every time they say buy more, when that window comes up, I want the spin box to have a value of 0. So that's what that function does. Next, I need to update the maximum purchase quantity. In other words, if the user can't buy an unlimited number of units of water. Therefore, I have to program a maximum, a ceiling in which they can't buy any more, or else they would go into negative accounting. And so how do I do that? Well, in this function on line 191, I'm creating a new variable, the max purchase quantity. Oops, it looks like I have a typo there. And then in line 193, I'm saying the maximum purchase quantity equals the current balance divided by the price of ingredient 1. I'm then telling in line 194 that I want my spin box's maximum value. I'm using the setMax method, and I'm telling it to be equal to, or I'm passing it the maximum purchase quantity. Very simple. 4 lines of code. Let's take a look at update total purchase price. Now, every time the user interacts with a spin box, the total price needs to increase. So if they wanted to buy 1 unit of water, that would be a total price of $1.25. If it was 2 units of water, of course, it would be $2.50. So how do I do that? Well, very simple. I'm creating a variable called total price. And then in line 190, I'm actually calculating total price. I want it to be the price of ingredient 1 times whatever value the user has specified in the spin box. And then, of course, I'm using a format string to actually display that information. So the result here, because the spin box is at 0, is total price : 0.00 gold coins. Very simple. Let's take a look at this last function, update purchase button availability. Now, importantly, when this view becomes available, we need to prevent the user from trying to buy 0 units of something. So if the spin box is 0, we want the purchase button to be disabled. And that's exactly what this function does. So in line 197, I say current spin box value equals get the value of the spin box, and then I just check. Is that value equal to 0? If it is, disable the purchase button. If it isn't, then that means there's something that can be purchased, so set the purchase button to be enabled. And all of that happens as soon as the buy ingredient 1 function is called. Now take a look at the bottom here, where I have incremented saying I want 2 units, and my total price would be 2.5 gold coins. And what happens now when the user clicks purchase? Let's take a look at that. I have a specific function called onPurchaseButtonPressed. The first thing I need to do is find out, well, how many units does the user want to buy? And I'm storing that in a local variable called number of units purchased. Then I'm calculating in line 213 the cost variable. And in line 215, I'm saying the cost is going to be equal to the price of ingredient 1 times the number of units purchased. And then I am changing or incrementing the quantity of ingredient 1 because they've bought something new. So I'm saying quantity of ingredient 1 plus the number of units purchased. And then outside of my if statement, I'm adjusting my current balance. I'm subtracting the cost from the current balance. And then I am refreshing. I'm calling all these functions that we've already looked at. I'm refreshing my purchase data. I'm resetting my spin box. I'm updating the purchase button availability, and I'm updating the total purchase price. So I wanted to walk through this with you to show you how to break some complex functionality down into bite-sized pieces. And I hope you can see that by looking at my example of buy ingredient 1 and how I have broken up little pieces of functionality into separate small functions that only have 3, 4, 5 lines of code. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. Have a great week, and I'll see you in Canvas.